Good evening. I know we're waiting for a few more to turn up. We have some latecomers, so but we'll get going because time is precious, and I know Tim has other engagements tonight. Good evening. I'm Christian. I'm the director here at the Centre for Social Justice. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here for tonight's event, The State Our Children Are In, and we are launching today a paper called Forgotten Families. We'll hear a bit about that in a second. And of course we are here to listen to Tim Loughton, the former Children's Minister and leading parliamentarian. I'll talk about that very topic. Tim actually gave a shorter version of tonight's speech at a very packed and hot Conservative Party conference fringe, but the demand to hear more was so great that we thought we'd better host another event, and so it's great to have you with us tonight. His speech has just been trailed in the Telegraph today, I think in the Daily Express too, and elsewhere. I've written an op-ed in today's Telegraph. It's not too late to pick up a copy, so I suggest it's worth a read, unless Tim's bought all of them. Well, I'm sure he hasn't. So it's been well trailed. That wasn't supposed to be offensive. It's been really well trailed, and I think one or two in number 10 are a bit nervous as well, which is always a very good sign going into something like this. For those of you who don't know, the CSJ was established to put social justice at the heart of British politics. We're proud to be independent in that task. We work on a cross-party basis across Westminster. We've just spent this autumn hosting a series of lectures for the Labour Party, with David Lammy and John Cruddas on Thursday evening. So if you're interested in coming to hear John Cruddas, who's leading the Labour Party's policy review, please let us know. And we've had Graham Allen too, who spoke about the importance of early intervention. David Blunkett, of course, a well-known figure of the left, chairs our advisory board as a think tank, and we've got some excellent relationships with Lib Dems too, and we exist to change the debate about poverty and actually disorder by looking to strengthen the things that prevent poverty, such as stable families and safe childhoods, inspirational education, the rewards of work instead of welfare dependency. And to do this, I make sure our team spends as much time as possible outside Westminster, rooted in the most disadvantaged parts of the UK, learning the lessons from people whose lives have been transformed by the interventions that have been offered to them. So we are quite a deep and practical think tank, and that's because since 2004, when Ian Duncan Smith established the centre, we've built a unique network of 320 small but innovative grassroots charities. And they're working with people that most of us have written off. They're getting people off heroin. They are working with gang members at 1 AM in the morning. They're under the bridge with people who are homeless or working in the streets. They might be working with adult prisoners, trying to help them to read and write. They're organisations and people that transform lives every day, and it is through that network that the CSJ generates a huge amount of our analysis, our understanding, but also many of our ideas. One of the key things we've called for consistently as a think tank is the strengthening of family life, and especially work to prevent the devastating impact of family breakdown. And too often it's seen as just inevitable that levels of family breakdown exist, but it is not inevitable, and it's for think tanks like the CSJ to say so. You'll hear from Samantha in a second, Dr. Samantha Cannon, about our work on families. But our work on families isn't about a moral judgment. It's not about saying something's wrong or right, or that certain family structures are better than others. It's about looking at the impact and the stability that certain situations offer to adults and children, and what sets people back when family breakdown hits. So Samantha will speak for about 10 minutes on our new report, Forgotten Families, and then we'll move straight to Tim, who I'll just quickly introduce after Samantha. He will then speak for about 25 minutes, half an hour, and then we'll open up to questions from the floor. So Samantha's bio, to be honest, is far too long for me to read out now, but she's a world-renowned academic, an expert in family policy, mental health, the early years, has authored, from what I can see, is one of the most important textbooks on family policy written for a long time, and in a former life was family and society advisor to David Cameron. And for those with short-term memories, on Friday night last week, she was on Any Questions on Radio 4. Did a very, very good job. Samantha, over to you to tell us about today's paper.
dysfunction, and it's just amazing to look out and see so many people who've helped our work over the last, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years. Melanie Gill, who's just told me everything I know about family dysfunction, if I may use that. Sounds like a very pejorative term, but we have to call a spade a spade. Families where maybe mum and dad are together, but there's no care for the child. And as Christian said, we're not kind of putting certain family forms on a pedestal. What really matters is what goes on inside family lives, and we work with the reality of what's on the ground. And so many people here have invited us to come and look at their projects. You can see Hilary, the teenage parent expert in the room, and we really, really appreciate the help you've given us over the years. The impact we've had has been because you have opened your doors and given us valuable time and resource, so thank you so much. And I don't know if I've got Helen Crichton here from Danone, but I want to say thank you so much to Danone and to Bounty for sponsoring the paper. It's really good to work with partners in the private sector, because they Bounty, for example, they did massive polling for us that gave us some really valuable insights. So they opened up their huge database on young mums, and it's just great to work in partnership. So thank you to everyone. And I must be quick, because I know we're launching our paper here today, but it is a real honour to be a warm-up act for a politician as respected in his field as Tim Loughton. So I won't keep you too long. They do download the paper in full colour from the website. In it, we austerity times. In it, we look across a full range of policy areas where the nation's families would really benefit from being given a much higher and explicit priority in the government's thinking. And while we welcome the reforming character of the Department for Education that has a relentless focus on improving educational outcomes, speeding up adoption, enshrining children's need for fathers in law, the importance of fathers and being part of fathers' everyday lives when families are separated is something we really spend a lot of time thinking about. But we really deeply regret the lack of attention to family policy in the Department for Education, and to what we feel has to be its overriding priority. We need to do all we can to prevent family breakdown, whether it's through divorce or separation, dysfunction, as I've already said, or fatherlessness, as I've mentioned as well. Because stronger families really will help to further the aims of all these reforms. So I could spend the whole time just talking about how those 3 areas could be hugely enhanced by working more with the family, but I'll just take education. The University of Bristol found 80% of the variability in children's achievement is down to pupil level factors, what happens in and around the home, not school quality. Just 20% is about school quality. And I'm a parent of 2 A-level students, and I'm a governor in their state school, and my on-the-ground experience really backs up that finding. And the British public completely gets this too. We did some very recent polling and found almost half said a safe community and environment was the most important for children to have when growing up, and part of that will be the family they're in. Around a third said it was having 2 parents at home. Only 6% said a place at a good school, and 6% said having enough money. I mean, this is really important to kind of take stock of, because when children come to school from a pressure cooker of hurt, abandonment and low self-worth, they find it really hard to learn, and that can be lack of nurture at home as a result of parents themselves having really profound unmet mental health and other emotional needs. And as I keep saying, if your dad didn't stick around, if you have no contact with him for whatever reason, that can be deeply undermining. We've talked to many young and older addicts, drug addicts especially, and they talk about a kind of double whammy. Not only do I not know my dad, I don't even know who he is necessarily, he's certainly not around, but they're often part of a subculture in which there are no fathers around. No one has a dad to kind of bat in their corner. And it's doubly hurtful because there's no recognition that lack of a father would even be an issue. Well, nobody's got a dad, so you can't say that's an issue. And they've said to us that really is hard to cope with. But worryingly, as our paper says, by the time a child is 15, he or she has only a 1 in 2 chance of still living with both parents. So it's far more likely they will still have that they'll have a TV in their bedrooms than a father in the house. But a child born 40 years earlier, that's from the 1958 National Child Development Study, that cohort study, a child born 40 years earlier has less than a 1 in 6 chance of growing up in a broken family. I mean, that's a staggering leap, from 1 in 6 to 1 in 2. And many social indicators like this are heading in the wrong direction. It's all in the paper. And we will not see a turnaround with the few politically uncourageous measures we have seen so far from the coalition, despite their pledge to make this the most family-friendly country in the world. And perhaps the best example of this is in the area of marriage. There is still nothing to bolster marriage per se, yet we cannot ignore this vital institution if we want to foster a culture that values stable relationships. Whatever their income and education, parents who are not married when they have children are at least twice, it's much higher than that, twice as likely to split up. And regardless of the pros and cons of same-sex marriage, only 0.1% of children are living in these families. We need to do all we can to strengthen the relationships of them and the parents, raising the remaining 99.9% of children. So the 2001 census found 97% of all couples still together by the time the children were 15 were married. So we can't ignore marriage. My life would be a lot easier. I'd have a lot more people would agree with me. But the British public often agree with me, where perhaps the academics and the lobby groups struggle to. And our polling shows that more than half of people under 50 who aren't yet married really want to be married. Anyway, we do understand the realities of coalition politics, but it seems as if there's always a reason to back away from this agenda, despite the rhetoric of future premiers when they are in opposition. So, when we look at both Blair and Cameron, they both talked about the importance of stable families. Blair described family breakdown as a moral and economic evil. But his intent to do something about it unravelled under pressure from feminists in his cabinet. And I have to say that Cameron is still not the senior coalition partner on this issue. He's not yet grasped control of the family agenda, and I believe he is sincere about wanting to strengthen the family. So it will be a personal blow, as well as bad for the country, if he has cause to regret his lack of progress when he takes stock of his legacy. Now, our recent polling suggests he may be taking stock quicker than he would like, because we found over a third of the public thinks less of David Cameron for not yet fulfilling his promise to recognise marriage in the tax system. Only 4% think more, and this is what I mean about the British public kind of gets this. Now, if the autumn statement had unveiled a tax break for marriage, this would, to some extent, have offset real terms tax credit cuts for the working poor. Let me unpack that. It's a bit of a long sentence. The influential Institute of Fiscal Studies, highlighted by CARE, I can see at the background, Dan from CARE, said the poorest 20% benefit most from transferable tax allowances for single earner married couples. Wealthier families are much more likely to have 2 earners. So the richest half of families benefit disproportionately from rises in personal tax thresholds. In fact, the IFS graph suggests it's earners in the very top 20% get the biggest real terms benefit. Now, you don't hear Labour talking about that. So, an interesting way to look at the situation. Now, given that family breakdown costs $44 billion per year, support for a range of measures to help prevent it makes fiscal sense. The government is currently spending just 1/1000 of that, $45 million, on an overall family strengthening package. So yeah, I know they're spending, but there's some money from the DWP on an innovation fund to help support couples after separation. We welcome that, but it's just not enough to make the big difference there needs to be in such a profound cultural issue. And in our paper we argue gripping the family agenda requires cabinet level leadership someone with real vision and ambition for the family, who is not bowed to the inevitability of breakdown, as Christian said. Somebody who wakes up every morning thinking about how the government and its partners in health, and in the voluntary sector in particular, can seize every opportunity to make a difference. Because family issues should be at the heart of the public health agenda. The influence of relationships and quality of care, particularly in the early years, on a huge range of public health issues: diabetes, smoking, alcohol consumption, exercise, and yet in the public health outcomes framework, it's just not there. And I know money is tight, but what we have to tackle is a culture of breakdown that really flies in the face of what people feel is important for the nation's children. This is our polling from Bounty in the paper, more than half of lone parents consider it important that a child grows up living with both parents. I mean, that's actually quite staggering. More than half. 1 in 5 said it was very important. If you've just got to remember, so many lone parents didn't choose it, don't really want it for their children, find it jolly hard going it alone with children. I don't know how I'd manage it. But 1 in 5 lone mothers said it's very important the child grows up living with both parents. And 3/4 of lone mothers, sorry for all the stats, they're all in the paper, 3/4 of lone mothers and almost 9 in 10 step parents agree the government should say stability matters for children. And rhetoric does make a difference. Without wanting to trivialise it, rhetoric doesn't cost anything in terms of, what the statements politicians make. There's not a kind of £1 billion price tag, but emphasising the importance of well-functioning families can be done in a way that respects the reality of family diversity. But it doesn't minimise its challenges. Say, well, all families come in all shapes and sizes. Of course they do. But we've got to be clear about, as we've said before, clear about what tends to work best. And I think, frankly, one politician who really gets the balance right in the way he talks about family is Tim Loughton. So, the moment you've all been waiting for, I'm just really glad that Tim can come and speak to us today. It's a real honour, as always, to have him. And over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Samantha, thank you very much for that, and thank you, Christian, for introducing me earlier as former Children's Minister. Some people choose ex-Children's Minister, which sounds a bit terminal, I feel, but it's great to be here back at the CSJ, and I think I want to say on behalf of all of us here as well, a thank you to the CSJ for all the work, the huge amount of work that the CSJ do around the family, around child poverty, around social mobility. Which really does make a difference, and the brand of the CSJ, I think, has become huge in recent years, and clearly there's a lot more work to be done, and we can't afford to let up. Now, my speech today is a bit of a tour d'horizon around children's issues, although it seems to be billed in the Telegraph as talking purely about marriage, tax allowances, and family. I want to talk about a number of different issues around children, and really try and foment a bit of a discussion. And as Christian said, really taking up where I left off in my talk to the CSJ at the Conservative Party conference, when I spoke about my 10-point plan for families, and why I think that this government needs to absolutely reassert its recognition and appreciation of the family, what it stands for, what it achieves across so many different areas of policy making and different government departments. But today I want to do that in the context of the relationship between family and the state, and the increasingly precarious position of children somewhere in between the two. Now, rather than title my talk, "The State Our Children Are In," I could equally have called it "The Children Our State Is In." Much of my work previously as Children's Minister and as Shadow Children's Minister for many years before that was involved with children in care whose parents were deemed unsuitable to bring them up either on a permanent basis or more likely temporarily. That's a whole different and complicated subject, and I hope to be able to deal with that together with the issue of safeguarding and child sexual exploitation, particularly in the context of the revelations since Savile, at a later date with the help of the CSJ, and I'm very happy to take questions and raise that in the discussion afterwards. But beyond those children for whom the state has direct parental responsibility, hardly a day goes by without headlines urging government action to intervene to make children safer by adding more regulations to safeguarding manuals, to restricting more manifestations of social media, or simply to wrap children up in yet more cotton wool. Occasionally, after a disaster of one kind or another befalling a child, there will be the ominous question, where were the parents? Now, by all accounts, growing up in Britain in the year 2012 is more challenging than almost ever before, or that's at least what my 3 teenage children tell me, usually heralding a bid for an increase in allowances or as mitigating circumstances for failing to return home at the agreed time. But pressures to get into the chosen school, to perform well at the right school, to look cool, to be resilient in the light of peer pressure and safeguard one's integrity both on and off social media, the many-faceted phenomena of the commercialisation and sexualisation of childhood are all everyday challenges that all of our children and young people have to deal with from an increasingly early age. And to begin at the beginning, conception ain't what it used to be either. Certainly it can be far more complicated than I ever experienced or was experienced on my behalf. A story the other day related the complicated quadrilateral for a child with 4 parents, effectively, as a result of a sperm donor impregnating a surrogate mother with the resulting child being adopted by a lesbian couple. Another reported fears of a sperm donor thought to be responsible for siring no fewer than 600 children in just one area alone, and the potential for siblings unknowingly hooking up later in life. There's a CSA disaster in the making. And there was another rather more questionable story which quoted a piece of research that had claimed that women who take slimming and thyroid pills during pregnancy are substantially more likely to have gay children. Very confusing. Now, there are those who seem to want to make the already sufficiently bewildering process of growing up yet more bewildering by using their children as guinea pigs in the ultimate PC gender experiment. Earlier this year I came across the story of the Canadian parents of a child with the eminently gender-neutral name of Storm, who had resolved to keep the sex of their baby secret as part of an attempt to raise a genderless child. The parents say that it will be up to Storm to decide whether he/she chooses to live as a boy or girl, or as they put it, a tribute to freedom and choice in place of limitation, a stand-up to what the world could become in Storm's lifetime, a more progressive place. Poor Storm. Equally alarmingly, I read about 6 children who'd been prescribed drugs by an NHS clinic to delay puberty so that later gender change operations will be easier to carry out as a result of parents saying that their prepubescent kids are unsure about their gender. And currently in the green laboratory that is the city of Brighton and Hove, neighbouring my own constituency, such institutionalised confusion has become one step nearer with the proposal to ban the titles of Mr. and Mrs. on all council forms and paperwork after transgender activists complain that the forms force people to choose between genders. Now, even when you've got your gender sorted out, relationships between children and their parents are in danger of becoming increasingly sidelined by advances in technology. You can now buy prams that incorporate computer screens to engage a baby. Microsoft have designed a prototype teddy bear that contains microphones, a camera, and software that can monitor the child whose image has been programmed into the computer and relay appropriate, soothing, pre-recorded words from the biological parents who may be hundreds of miles away. Who needs the stimulation of human touch and the building blocks of attachment when you can have it all delivered remotely down a fibre optic cable? Indeed, when our children are a bit older, need they look to other human beings for their stimulation when we increasingly isolate our young people interacting over the internet from the solitude of a flat screen in their bedrooms? Worse still, a recent report predicted that by the year 2050, robot lovers will be commonplace. The rise of the sex bots adds a whole new angle to the sperm donor quadrilateral I described earlier. And if that's not confusing enough, with teenage girls worrying about body image and an alarming 12% of young teenage girls aspiring to cosmetic surgery, according to a Girl Guide study, then the futurology experts at BT have predicted that within 10 years, computer chips that store music, just like an iPod, could be built into girls' breasts implants. The Sun has already done all the jokes about how you tune them in. But perhaps saddest of all was the report last month that a Brazilian teenager, Catarina, sold her virginity over the internet to the highest bidder for £490,000 in a controversial and fiercely contested online auction. It's actually all rather sad and rather tragic. And technology marches on through the medium of social media. No self-respecting teenager leaves home without checking statuses on Facebook or tweeting prolifically. Yet with Facebook keen to dispense with the advisory age for having a presence on Facebook of 13, despite the unresolved dangers around cyberbullying, do child protection considerations stand any chance of keeping pace with child communication imperatives? And now the head of Google has suggested in an article in the Wall Street Journal that the private lives of youngsters are so well documented on the internet that they should be encouraged automatically to change their names on reaching adulthood, to distance themselves from embarrassing photographs and material on social media sites. Little wonder that mental health problems are affecting so many of our young people younger. Little wonder that research from the University of Greenwich claims that young people are increasingly suffering from a quarter-life crisis. I just had my midlife crisis, but a quarter-life crisis in their 20s as they seek more meaning from their existence and their identities. And amidst the high-tech circus and social media frippery lurk some deeply alarming statements of how society views young people and how teenage girls in particular view their lot. As the NSPCC warned earlier this year, as many as 280,000 teenage girls are suffering from sexual abuse because they believe it is an accepted part of relationships or do not believe that they can stop it. Or the chilling description from social workers in Rochdale, which we're all familiar with, about 14 and 15-year-old girls entrapped into a web of sexual abuse at the hands of 40, 50-year-old strangers, that they had somehow made a lifestyle choice to be treated in that way. So where is the government in all of this? Where are the parents in all of this? And where exactly does family feature in all of this? Is it an outmoded concept, a throwback to the 1950s caricatured by Nick Clegg as a model of, I quote, suit-wearing, bread-winning dad and aproned home-making mother? Or whether it's the Mitchells' constant refrain in EastEnders that we're family, or David Cameron's pre-election creed that family is in his DNA, I believe family does matter to most people, and we had those statistics from Samantha earlier. But without getting bogged down in the truism that modern families come in many different forms, all the research shows that the presence of mum and dad throughout childhood gives children the best chance of good health, successful education, and freedom from dependency and the justice system. At its extreme, the absence of strong family structures contributes to the chaos of the herd instinct and lawlessness that we saw in last summer's riots. On an everyday basis, family breakdown costs society up to £44 billion a year, so it is vital that we heed the CSJ's own shocking revelation that 48% of all children will see the breakdown of their parents' relationship, or that by the end of his or her childhood, a youngster is considerably more likely to have the television set in his or her bedroom, as Samantha said, than a father living at home. And as one commentator in The Telegraph put it earlier this autumn, the combination of family instability and a vulgar, celebrity-obsessed low IQ and all but inescapable popular culture means that British children lead the Western world in many forms of self-destructive as well as unattractive behaviour. Now, family did matter to the government. It was in the manifesto for the Conservative Party. It was in the coalition agreement. David Cameron mentioned it no fewer than 16 times in his last party conference speech as leader of the opposition. Yet where is the government's comprehensive programme on family in action, given its implications economically and socially, and who is responsible for leading it? And under the banner of family, then marriage matters too. Worryingly on present trends, by 2047, as the CSJ's research shows again, The prediction is that families headed by a married couple will be a minority, representing just 49.5% of all families. And as Breakthrough Britain demonstrated, fewer than 1 in 10 married parents have split by the time a child is 5, compared with more than 1 in 3 couples who are not married. Now that's hugely important, because although most single parents, often single, not of their own volition, and there's nothing judgmental about this, do a fantastic job in very difficult circumstances, but the evidence is starkly clear that on average, children brought up in married families do better than those brought up in single-parent families on every significant measure: educational achievement, health, likelihood of getting into trouble with the law, alcohol, drug abuse, and so on. But have we really drilled down into the question of why the ratio of 1 in 5 children living with a single parent in the UK is so high and rising, the 4th highest rate throughout all European countries? What is causing that statistic and that continued relentless rise? And after a marital split, the income of the woman with children, as it usually is, falls on average by 12%, so poverty usually follows with all its implications. And in contrast, as the research from the US shows, a stable family home has been found to raise a child's chances of escaping the poverty trap by no less than 82%. Now, as I've said, this is not to undermine the role of those parents who find themselves outside of marriage for all sorts of reasons. These things are not mutually exclusive, that one can promote one form of relationship without undermining the other, but it is an inescapable statistical fact that children within families have a distinct advantage, and for all the reasons given above, that has to be a desirable thing, not least for the state, who will have to underwrite the cost of many of the downsides. So that's why I said today in the Telegraph that it's particularly disappointing that last week's autumn statement, the Chancellor appears to have failed to make good the coalition government's promise on a transferable tax allowance between married couples, notwithstanding all the get-out provisions for our coalition partners to be able to abstain. Now, let us not be suckered into thinking that most or many people fall in love and marry just for financial reasons. However, when they fall in love and decide that they want to be together, they face a choice. Do they marry and make a public, lifelong commitment to each other in law, or do they move in with each other and see how it goes? And as my colleague Lord Hill of Orford, the Education Minister, noted in the Lords, research from the Millennium Cohort suggests that the poorest 20% of married couples are more stable than all but the richest 20% of cohabiting couples. Marriage is not a preserve of the middle classes. Now, the UK is increasingly isolated here, and if you look around the OECD and the EU, we are virtually alone in not recognising marriage in the tax system. The latest international comparison figures demonstrate that in the UK, one-earner married couples on an average wage with 2 children face a tax burden that is no less than 42% greater than the average in the OECD. Add to this the hugely complicating child benefit reforms that are about to hit some of the most stable, striving and hard-working families. It begs the question, why do we seem intent on penalising those that we should be most encouraging? So it's doubly disappointing, given the clear support for the government to support families and recognise marriage within the tax system in particular. Now, Ian Duncan Smith, who founded this august institution, is rightly overhauling the marriage penalty out of the benefit system, and the universal credit reforms must succeed. But the gold standard of the transferable tax allowance appears sunk by the bigot-gate mentality of the Lib Dems. Hard-working married couples, as well as those committed through civil partnerships, save the state money. More than ever, they need the state to recognise and reward that. Tony Blair's words back in 1995 that a strong society cannot be morally neutral about the family still ring true. But for those of you who lack morals, surely your state cannot be fiscally neutral either. And the CSJ poll published today, as Samantha says, reveals that not just 47% of Conservative supporters feel betrayed by the Prime Minister on this mission, but 35% of voters overall. And I doubt that the government will enjoy anything like compensatory approval ratings for announcing in the same week that gay marriage has apparently become a more urgent issue for government action, despite no similar manifesto commitment to legislate, and after a massive consultation exercise which has been overwhelmingly negative. But we won't get onto that subject here because I think it's going to be taking up a lot of the airwaves in the coming days and weeks. So what should the relationship between state, family and children be in practice? Let me just briefly sketch out my vision for that relationship and give some examples of where I think practical action prompted by government would empower children and the family, not subsume them. Part of my modest 10-point plan for a government serious about promoting the value of family and our responsibilities to children above the grip of the state. Now, firstly, we're balancing the relationship between state and family. The role of the state is surely to support families, not supplant them. For many, the surreptitious influence of the anti-smacking brigade, the obesity police, or the accusing bureaucracy of excessive CRB checks, which the government are now reversing, has led many decent parents to question their own right and capability often to parent. Looking back at the report commissioned by the Commission on Families and the Wellbeing of Children, established by the then NCH and the National Family and Parenting Institute, just back in 2004, I was struck by just how paternalistic its recommendations were. Set up as a study into the relationship between the state and the family in the upbringing of children, amongst the obligatory recommendations for the state to criminalise smacking by parents and raise the age of criminal responsibility, it is littered with examples of how the role of various government departments and public agencies in prescribing services handed down to parents, requested or not, should be set out. By way of contrast, the Family Commission set up by 4 children and chaired by Esther Ransom more recently took a much more enabling approach. Families should be offered relationship support in times of relationship breakdown with the support of an online portal for families, run by families, for families. A family-friendly kite mark, like an investor in people accreditation, should guide families to family-friendly employers and practices, not mandate them. And a legal entitlement for a family group conference, giving them the right to shape the solutions to family changes themselves, is another recommendation that I support. But that is the approach that I have always favoured, where the state is there to serve, to enable, to promote the family, not to stifle nor direct or to supplant, other than in the severe cases where neglect or cruelty manifestly is harming the children. Now, of course the interests of the children must come first, but for the vast majority of families, the interests of the parents do not and should not make that mutually exclusive, and we sometimes seem to drive a wedge between the two. Now, I appreciate that this becomes highly problematic when we stray into the territory of underage sex, teenage contraception and Gillick competence. The number of schoolgirls given long-term contraceptive implants and injections has more than trebled in parts of the country in the last 2 years alone. Even more alarmingly, the number of underage and repeat abortions has risen heavily too. Meanwhile, we apparently have a stalemate on the curriculum review of quality sex and relationship education. Surely, we need parents to have a greater role in all of this, and we need to have a proper warts and all debate about it. Parents should be confident enough in themselves and their abilities, confident enough to seek appropriate support when they need it, and not always be looking over their shoulder trying to second-guess the latest government crackdown to curb obesity, substance abuse, or antisocial behaviour, or whatever it may be. So I think we need a confidence-boosting crusade of localism for parents, just as the government is rightly promoting localism for local communities. Now, secondly, early intervention. Intervening early is key. Strong attachment between a child and parent shapes the whole of childhood from birth. Where that attachment is missing, it needs rehabilitating early. When older children start to go off the rails, early intervention is key. Now, the government has rightly championed the principle of early intervention, but it needs to become more than a slogan and a function of the now defunct early intervention grant. And as the CSJ's own report card on the Coalition for Family Credentials stated, early intervention is central to reversing social breakdown. Those with poor speech, at the age of 2, for example, are doomed to a lifetime of failure unless they receive help, a government advisor has warned. Though the same, now ex-government advisor, also advocated the ultimate nannying role for the DFE of sending text messages to poor parents to remind them to switch off the TV and talk to their babies. And of course, Frank Field has a point when he claims that the success individuals achieve during their adult lives can be predicted by their ability level on their first day of primary school. That 80% of the impacts that happen outside of a classroom or a school environment. Now, the government is rightly promoting early attachment, be it through an extension of the health visitor role, early years assessments, making sure that Children's centres and family hubs are accessed by those most in need, but in many cases least likely to access them. And as my parliamentary colleague Andrea Ledson has said, and she's an expert in the field of attachment, having run charities offering attachment services, the baby that is securely attached to his or her carer will generally be able to cope with the life's ups and downs and will develop an innate sense that the world is a good place. The baby whose carer is depressed, over-anxious, or who has issues with substance misuse, domestic violence, or severe mental health problems can often not achieve that essential secure bond. Indeed, a US academic study has shown that teenagers from a family with a history of alcoholism have brains wired for risk-taking, which helps explain why alcohol problems can run in families and provides another example of the need to break the generational downward cycle. Now, my former boss, Michael Gove, is rightly and heroically driving a revolution in the quality of schooling for all as the best prospect of promoting social mobility and widening the ladder out of poverty. But we also need strong families, strongly attached to their children, to get level-headed, balanced kids to arrive at school in the first place, hungry to and able to learn and to benefit from staying there. Young people who read at home on a daily basis are 13 times more likely to perform above the level expected for their age in literacy. Pushy teachers need pushy parents as well. And whilst this might sound more nannying than most of the support mechanisms I am highlighting here today, it's surely a good investment when we know the price of failure financially and socially. And that's why I'm also a strong supporter of the government's flagship project on troubled families. It will be game-changing if it can join up action between professionals focused on solving the often multi-generational, multiple problems that those expensive families suffer and inflict on others. Family intervention projects, the forerunner of the Troubled Families Programme, or Families with Multiple Problems as it was originally called when I was responsible for it, have an impressive track record. Piloted in places like Nottingham between 2007 and 2011, families enrolled in FIPS saw a 58% reduction in antisocial behaviour, and their children were 53% less likely to truant or have problems at school. And notably, the results also revealed a 34% reduction in the number of families with child protection issues as well. These are huge gains for early intervention at an early age or early intervention at an early stage for older children in chaotic families, but it needs to be part of a coordinated and joined up family policy that addresses why those problems happen in the first place and keep happening. We need a family with multiple problems approach for a government that needs to overcome multiple family policy problems itself. Thirdly, shared parenting. Shared parenting means both parents. Dadlessness impacts heavily on teenage boys especially, yet still too many willing fathers are frozen out of their parenting role after an acrimonious split with a partner. The government needs to stick to its guns to introduce a long overdue full presumption of shared parenting in the forthcoming children bill. It will again face a barrage of opposition from vested interests, but we must see it through. It does not undermine the paramountcy principle of the welfare of the child if legislation requires courts to ensure that both parents play as full a part as possible in the upbringing of their children, however acrimonious a split may have been. In 91% of cases, it is the father who is likely to be the non-resident and potentially increasingly marginalised parent. An absent father leaves a gap that no one else could ever quite fill. But before it comes to that, parenting and relationship support needs safeguarding and expanding through children's centres and other programmes which are still very mum-centric and too often treat dads as an afterthought. It is to be greatly welcome that the government has been investing heavily in relationship support and in parenting classes for both parents, using expertise, unjudgmental expertise in particular of the voluntary sector. And as Rob Williams put it whilst he was Chief Executive of the Fatherhood Institute, we need to equalise our expectations of fathers and mothers and hold both to account for their responsibilities, from registering the birth to looking after a child's health, schooling, nutrition, and even behaviour. The system assumes that mothers are the responsibility holders and fathers may or may not be involved. I think we have changed. I think relationships have changed. I think the role of mother and father has changed drastically in the last 20 years. Fourthly, role models. Another side product of dadlessness is in part the absence of role models. There was an interesting piece in The Sun recently by Lord Sugar, not someone I usually empathise with, but he was lamenting the lack of profile of role models in business influencing children and young people. Of course, it doesn't stop there, because if you ask teenagers today who their role models are, they would like us not mention some footballer or reality show C-list celeb who've probably both been plastered all over the tabloids, stumbling out of a nightclub plastered and with the remnants of a line peppering their nostrils. Yet as Mariella Frostrup observed in her Mail on Sunday column last month, surely we should be using the cult and power of celebrity to communicate strong messages to impressionable young men in particular. And she advocates a man army determined to change cultural stereotypes amongst those who condone, or worse still, engage in some of the more appalling forms of sexual abuse that have hit our headlines too often over recent months. They need to say loud and proud that rape is for cowards, child abuse is despicable, and treating girls like pieces of meat is simply unacceptable. On a more mundane level, we need academic role models as well, making it cool to do well at school. According to the latest study from the National Literacy Trust, 1 in 6 children admitted that they were too embarrassed to read in front of their friends for fear of being labelled a geek. Is that a uniquely British destructive trait? Not that long ago, youngsters would have identified their role models as a favourite grandfather, a successful aunt, or even a resident father. Seldom is that the case now. And with politicians, police, public service broadcasters increasingly smeared and demonised in the public eye with varying degrees of justification, who are our children and grandchildren supposed to look up to? That brings me to my 5th category, which I've called When Harry Met Granny. One of the most depressing forces at work, I think, in society has been a growing distrust between generations, and ne'er the twain shall meet. Fueled by shoddy and selective media reporting where every teenager is portrayed as some prospective hoodie-wearing mugger, young people appear increasingly cut adrift from our older citizens. Aren't we missing a trick here? Not least for those teenage boys lacking a father's influence at home. Should the state not be working with businesses, with voluntary organisations, to harness the growing pool of recently retired but restless seniors who can offer mentoring skills to dadless teenage boys, for example, who need directions in their lives? Many talented people not ready for the Ovaltine and slippers quite yet. I want to see a national register promotional campaign and training support available to build such an army of volunteers. Similar young people who volunteer disproportionately more than any other age group have much to offer to older people in return. The diverse range and energy of those excellent games makers at the Olympics and Paralympics showed how we really could all be in this together. Another social prize with huge potential financial benefits for the state as well. And as someone who's been involved with the excellent National Citizen Service from inception, I can see the enormous potential here in social cohesion and cultivating a sense of belonging and national identity. Sixthly, we need to re-energise the Bailey Review. Reg Bailey's excellent report into the sexualisation and commercialisation of childhood made specific recommendations to support responsible parents battered on all sides by advertisers and media intent on making their children prematurely grown to adult consumers. Research for UNICEF UK reiterated that children in the UK feel trapped in a materialistic culture and don't have enough time with their families. The implementation of the Bailey Review needs to become a priority by this government. So far it's been more about warm words than urgent action, but its implementation needs to be in partnership with parents and children and not in isolation from them. 7. Flexibility around childcare. The government has a good track record around flexible parental leave and expanding free nursery care for the poorest, but over-regulated childcare for the majority remains extortionate. Quality need not mean prohibitively expensive, and we need to see measures that facilitate more imaginative schemes such as workplace cooperatives run by parents themselves and where regulations are proportionate to accessibility. The CSJ has done work in this area as well, and their own excellent study published earlier in the autumn revealed how without reform of childcare, a single parent with 3 children needing after-school care would be 17 pence an hour worse off if she or he took a job. A single parent with 2 children would only be 2 pence an hour better off in work. With 445,000 UK families receiving state support towards their childcare costs, an average payment amounting to £232 a month, This is not some fringe activity, and the government really does need to get a grip on an issue which is bound to weigh heavily in manifestos at the next election. Eighth, and I'm almost there, cotton wool kids. We need a renewed crackdown on the health and safety mentality which risks assesses rough and tumble activities out of sight. Kids take knocks, pick themselves up and learn from them, get over it. But it's more complicated than that. Figures last week showed that half as many children are now being admitted to casualty after falling out of a tree as they were 10 years ago. Good news or bad news? But children are almost twice as likely now to go to hospital for injuries caused by repetitive and strenuous movement, such as playing on their computers and Xboxes for too long. I prefer my kids to fall out of a tree than to be spending all their time on an Xbox. It's hardly surprising when it's been estimated that by the time they turn 7, children born today will have spent the equivalent of an entire year watching some form of small screen, starting with the pram that I mentioned earlier. What is potentially worrying about that is that the internet addiction causes changes in the brain like those seen in alcoholics and cocaine addicts. And we're now seeing rehab for people, particularly young people, addicted to the internet. Should the state be intervening to rebalance every child's day with 10 times as long spent on the computer or watching TV as playing outside? Is it up to the state to take away the cotton wool, wrap up warm and propel minors outside as they do from an early age in Scandinavian kindergartens, or should we just be making the healthier options more attractive? And as regards our attitudes to sport, are we in danger of fritting away the Olympic legacy in a misguided, mutually exclusive search for academic excellence? Back to the high tech, and ninthly, keeping kids safe online. I think this is one of the most important challenges that parents face today. The government has acted urgently to improve safeguarding against child abuse and particularly expose and counter child sexual exploitation. But for most parents, the everyday fear of children exposed to adult and violence images or to grooming and bullying via social media is a much more present minefield. The UK Council on Child Internet Safety, which I chaired, has done some important work to bring the whole industry together in a united and complementary collection of practical solutions. The aim is that wherever you look or wherever you turn, children and concerned parents will be confronted with warning messages about the hazards that lurk on the internet if not used responsibly and what you can do about it. Now, whilst inappropriate access to adult and violent images is a serious worry and can certainly be linked to attitudes by impressionable teenage boys to sex and relationships, I believe a potentially even bigger worry is the use and abuse of social media. We've only seen the tip of the iceberg so far. Social media is everywhere. It is the future. A report in last week's Telegraph revealed that Twitter and Facebook have become so pervasive that a third of young adults admit to using them even whilst in the bathroom. Liverpool judge Nigel Gilmore said that he is increasingly seeing in court instances which began on Facebook. Disputes on that social media in particular are leading to a growing number of violent crimes because members of the social network post messages that they would never dream of saying in person, face to face. Police are being forced to deal with petty squabbles on social network sites every day when they could be tackling more serious crimes. And whilst the government is trying to tackle abuse and harassment online, trolling, as it's more commonly known in the defamation bill, this is a debate that we have only just started, and one where more than most, the state has a leading role in so many aspects of a child's life. We could have a separate lecture and discussion on just that alone. I'll move swiftly on to my final point, which is to remember that kids are kids. Children have rights, and parents have responsibilities, but when 14-year-old girls who have been lured into sexual abuse by child sex exploiting gangs are described as having made lifestyle choices, as I said earlier, then misguided political correctness has knocked common sense completely out of court to a dangerous level. Parents need the confidence and the support of government that the parent-child status remains paramount until that child becomes an adult. And that's the most important basis of my observations here today. We complain about society's commercialisation and sexualisation of childhood, yet when we seek to put child rights ahead of the protection that children need whilst they remain children, then surely the state has become complicit with it. When we strive to prescribe in such terms how children should be brought up or taken away, we must do it in a way that does not undermine the confidence of good parenting, that in the vast majority of cases is the bedrock of strong families which produce resilient and balanced kids. Children are children for a reason. They are still growing up, their brains are still developing, and they need their parents to help them, to guide them, and to protect them in that process. The state, which generally makes for a lousy parent, needs to remember that first and foremost. Thank you very much.